And in the Lord's will, we should be wrapping up our study in 1 Corinthians in about 2 or 3 weeks' time. This morning I'd like to go with you through the first 4 verses of the 16th chapter in 1 Corinthians. And I would like to entitle our little study together, Loving the Brotherhood. You'll recall a verse from 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 17, where Peter says that we're to honor the king, fear God, honor the king, love the brotherhood, and there's one more part of the verse that I can't remember, but I've got the essential in it, that we have a responsibility as Christians to love the brethren. And this is something that I think each one of us here this morning is quite familiar with, our responsibility as Christians to show love one to another. Churches are like children. And in fact, in the letters of 2nd and 3rd John, in the end of the New Testament, the writer, John the Apostle, described the churches as children. And the reason churches are like children is because both churches and children are in the process of maturation. They are growing. Children don't normally assume adult responsibilities when they're 5 and 6 years old, unless extreme circumstances warrant it. And this morning, I would like for us to view ourselves as a local church as a human being. Let's just draw an analogy here and make a few comparisons. How mature are we as a group of believers? Are we pulling our full weight as far as God is concerned? Are we mature enough to where we are as interested in what goes on around us in the world of Christians as we are interested in our own personal selfish desires? I think most of us can look back in those troublous adolescent years in our lives when, for the first time, we became aware of what our moms and our dads had been doing for us for 15 or 16 or 17 years. They've been paying the bills and washing our dirty clothes and putting food on the table and taking us here and taking us there and giving us money when we needed it or demanded it, putting up with us and with our friends. And it isn't until a person is generally in that age bracket that they mature to the place where they begin to become aware of wider horizons than just me and themselves. And that's really what God wants us as a local group of Christians, and He wants local bodies of believers everywhere around the world to mature. Children don't normally assume financial responsibility until maturity. And Paul even indicates in 2 Corinthians chapter 12 that this is not the church's job necessarily to support the preacher, as it is the preacher's job to support the church for a period of time. And how backwards that is in our society today. Although in 1 Timothy chapter 5, Paul does turn it around and show the other side. This morning, plainly speaking, we're talking about Christian giving, and I'm going to steal the show from Mike here. He mentioned this morning that he's going to speak on giving from 2 Corinthians chapters 8 and 9 in a couple of weeks, and I hope that you will all come for that because it's something that we need to have teaching on. As soon as somebody mentions money and giving, there's a big red warning flag and a lot of mental blocks flash across our minds. And I hope that this morning that you will remember our past relationship with you and give us the benefit of the doubt that we're not trying to milk you from what you got. I hope that you'll see that we do not beg for money here, nor hammer you for what you have or what you do not have. Our interest this morning is to look into the Word of God, and this is where we have come in our study all the way through this book. It has come to the 16th chapter, and in the 16th chapter, the Apostle Paul is making an appeal to the Corinthians to grow up as a body of Christians, to widen their horizons, to recognize something that perhaps they never recognized before. In fact, I think Paul viewed the Corinthians as a bunch of babies. A bunch of kids in a nursery squabbling about the nicest toys and disagreeing amongst themselves and only interested in me, themselves. That's as wide as their interest went. All the adolescent attitudes that they had, irresponsibility, they were fascinated with spiritual gadgets like tongues, they were superficial, they were looking at appearances rather than realities. They were unsettled in their philosophy, just like adolescents are. They were groping around. They weren't really sure where they were going, and they were having all kinds of problems because they were baby Christians. In fact, that's what he calls them in the 3rd chapter. He says, I could not speak unto you as unto spiritual, but as unto babes, or as unto carnal, because you are yet babes, and you can't take the things that a mature adult needs to take and to follow. And even in the 16th chapter here in verse 13, in his closing remarks, he says, watch, stand fast in the faith, quit you like men, be strong. He's making an appeal to maturity. Now, we do not do a great deal, we never have had a great deal of teaching here at Northland on giving, simply because of the real mental block and the difficulty that faces people today. Mike alluded to this morning, that how many times we turn on the television and the radio and we see it in literature and junk mail that comes to us from, and it is junk mail in a large percentage, from Christian organizations. All they do is ask for money. And it's a real shame. And yet perhaps it's time, and I think that it's the Lord's will that we look at this morning, that maybe we begin to take another look at this subject of money, and I'm just going to pass over it in 1 week, and Mike's going to pick up next month. But I think we need to see what God really does hold out for us as Christians. As a local body of believers, it is true that we do not yet have established elders and commended workers here. We still have a ways to grow. It is true that we do support believers in other places. I know we're supporting Werner and Carol, and there are other individuals that some of you are supporting, and that's good. That shows a mature attitude that we're not merely concerned with our own things, and that's the way it should be. But perhaps we need to advance in this area. Maybe we need to send out missionaries. Maybe some of us need to go. Maybe we all together would be brought closer together if we saw our common responsibility to other believers and to other unsaved people around the world. Maybe it's time that we kind of jumped the gun, as it were, and got into action. It would give us something collective to do that perhaps we've never observed before. 1 Corinthians chapter 16 is more or less a supplement to the main themes of this book, but it is very illuminating. It tells us the way Corinth was, and in concluding this book, Paul makes an appeal for their collective maturity in 3 ways in this chapter. This chapter divides itself into 3 very neat little sections, and we're only looking at the first 4 verses this morning. First of all, he's making an appeal for them to mature in their relationship to other saints in other parts of the world. And that's what we're looking at this morning. In verses 5 to 14, he appeals to them to mature in their relationship to itinerant servants of God, or ministers, from other places in the world that come to their church and minister to them. They have responsibilities to those people. And thirdly, he points out in verses 15 to 18 that they have responsibilities to the resident leadership in their midst. So let's remember this chapter. This chapter conclusion is kind of like a wrap-up. And he's making an appeal. Listen, you people have all kinds of problems because you're babes. Now please grow up. Please be mature. Quit you like men. Look around you and see what is your responsibility, and then take it. And this is a very timely instruction. I think it's like a father's tete-a-tete with his adolescent son or with his daughter, talking with them about things that are issues that are not easy to talk about, but it's time that somebody says something about it for the benefit, for the help that adolescent might receive. I think it's rather fascinating that chapter 15 in this letter concludes with a challenge. It's a command by Paul to the Corinthians on an exalted spiritual level, having discussed the great doctrine of the resurrection. He concludes, Be ye therefore, my beloved brethren, steadfast and unmovable, and always abounding in the work of the Lord, for as much as you know that your labor is not in vain in the Lord. And the very next verse in the letter was an appeal for them to give. In other words, there's nothing incongruous about Christian giving and doing the work of the Lord. In fact, it's one and the same thing. It's part of the job. And so here's how, in a major respect, we as Christians can do the work of the Lord. Abound in the work of the Lord. This is something that's a spiritual issue. It's not a economic or financial issue only. We're not merely talking about money and economics here this morning, because if that's the way you look at it, then I guarantee you're going to be offended at what I say. Because I'm not going to approach you on a level of what you can afford and how much you aren't giving and how much you should give and why aren't you doing more. I'm just telling you that God expects you to do it. And it's not really me, it's Paul. I'm just passing on his information. This is Christian responsibility. Right? But there are spiritual issues involved. This is how we can serve the Lord. And if we will always look at everything we do as Christians from that angle, then we will be preserved from becoming easily offended. Okay? I'm not telling you this morning what you should do. Right? What we are doing is looking together at the Word of God to see perhaps there's an area in my life that I need to spruce up a little bit. Perhaps we could take on a project as Christians. Perhaps we need to look around us and see and become more involved and quit looking at money with a distasteful attitude and say, I'm going to keep all I get and I don't care what you say attitude, and begin to see that if we're God's children, then we need to act like God's son. Though he was rich for our sakes, yet he became poor, that we through his poverty might become rich. Let's read the first 4 verses and observe how we may love the brotherhood. Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I have given order to the churches of Galatia, even so do ye. On the first day of the week let every one of you lay by him in store, as God has prospered him, that there be no gatherings when I come. And when I come, whomsoever you shall approve by your letters, them will I send to bring your liberality unto Jerusalem. And if it be suitable that I go also, they shall go with me. And at that point, Paul begins to tell them his own personal plans about his intentions of coming down to Corinth. He talks about other traveling ministers, Timothy and Titus and Apollos and Stephanus and Fortunatus and other itinerant ministers that were traveling around from the churches, and he tells them their responsibilities towards these people. But first of all, Paul mentions the saints in Jerusalem. Let's remember where we are. This wall up here represents a picture of the Mediterranean world. Down in that corner you have Jerusalem. This is the cradle of Christianity. All right? And up here, the ceiling up here in the center, we have Corinth in Greece. Hundreds and hundreds of miles separating these people. And we gain some glimpses of the situation from other of Paul's writings in the New Testament and also the book of Acts, how that for 20 or 30 years, the area in Jerusalem was an economically depressed locality. It was there was a famine as well as tremendous political disaster. This was warfare between the Jews and the Romans during this period of time, and it culminated in 70 A.D. with the Romans sending a Roman governor general by the name of Titus, and he went and he overthrew Jerusalem and destroyed the whole area, just wiped it right out in 70 A.D. Now Paul was writing shortly before this period of time, and there was tremendous needs down there, and he's writing to Christians that are not part of the Roman world and telling them, like he was accustomed to telling Christians everywhere he went, that their brethren needed help. Simply speaking, their brethren needed help. And he says, you have a responsibility. You have a part to do. These 4 verses divide into 2 neat halves. The first verse shows us that their responsibility to share is emphasized, and in verses 2 to 4, the manner of sharing is elaborated. So he's telling them that they have a responsibility to share, and then he's going to tell them how to do it. Anytime you have a human enterprise, you have 2 things involved: money and organization. Always. Doesn't matter what it is. It's always going to cost something, and you've got to go about it a certain way. And that's what these 2 sections show us. They show us the responsibility of becoming financially involved with the needs of other believers everywhere. And secondly, it shows us how to do it, the method or the organization. Let's reread verse 1. And I'd like to point out 2 things that Paul emphasizes here about Christian giving. Number 1, it's a shared responsibility. We're not to support all the other Christians in the world. We couldn't, even if we wanted to. Right? Which will never happen. Right? It's a shared responsibility, and secondly, it's a singular responsibility. Sure, I am to pitch in with everybody else, but I am to pitch in. That's the point that Paul is making here. The collection for the saints, Paul says, is I have given order to the churches in Galatia. Galatia was a Roman province just east of Greece. Greece was divided into 2 sections. Macedonia in the north and Achaia in the south. Corinth was in the province of Achaia, and Thessalonica and Philippi and the other churches to whom he wrote letters were in Macedonia in the north. The 2 provinces together was the region of Greece. Now, Paul is saying that when he went through Galatia over here, that Roman province, and as he came down through Greece, everywhere he went, he was sharing responsibility. He was saying, passing on the word. You people have brethren in Christ who are poor and destitute and suffering, and I think you should help out. You really do. It's your responsibility. And Paul gives about 2 commands here in these verses, and the first one is in the first verse. He says, even so do ye. It's outright command. Aorist imperative. The word do simply is poieo. It means to perform or carry out or execute. And it's very similar to what he said to them in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 11, where he said, he wrote to them about a year later to these same Christians at Corinth, and he says, now, a year ago you people made great promises. You said, yeah, we'd like to help out. Sure, we'll help out. You just tell us when, and send a man through, and we'll send the money with you down there to help those folks out. And a year and a half later, the Corinthians still hadn't done anything about it. Big on talk and with a tight fist around their wallets, and they hadn't done anything. And Paul encouraged them. He says, now, as you have spoken, now perform the doing of it. And it really boils down to this. Words are not enough. Faith without works is dead. When it really boils down to it, everything in life hits the pocketbook, doesn't it? If you're going to be a missionary, you've got to have money, right? If you're going to raise a family, you've got to have money. Right? If you're going to build a church building, you've got a meeting house, you've got to have money. Right? It all boils down to money. So that we shouldn't have a big problem with money itself. Money is a fact of life, and there's nothing wrong with it. It's the love of it that's sin. It says money is not the root of all evil. The love of money is the root of all evil. And we as Christians have got to take our share here, our responsibility. Even so, perform the doing of it. Somebody has said that giving is the thermometer of our Christian love. Lots of times we as parents fall into a kind of a bad rut. Instead of giving our children time to show them that we love them and giving them ourselves, we kind of do our own thing and give them $10 to make them happy. You know, or give them a ticket to the show, or give them this toy to play with, or give them that. See? But if we really love them, then we're going to give them what they need. It was Jesus that said that it's more blessed to give than to receive, and yet the average person would rather let the other guy have all the blessings. And well, Paul is simply saying, listen, Christians, when it boils down to it, sooner or later It's your responsibility, it's my responsibility to dole out. If the work of the Lord is going to be forwarded, it's going to cost money. Now, we don't make appeals for money here. And I'm not making an appeal for any specific person or project this morning. I am simply elaborating on the last few words of verse 1. So do ye. Right? Someday, this ministry is going to have leadership that isn't going to be supported by American and other Canadian churches like they are now. I'm supported by other believers in other places. Right? Now, someday, it's going to rest on you folks to support people who are going to spend all their time for your spiritual welfare. And 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 17 is a specific example there, that let the elders that rule well be worthy of double honor, which simply means financial remuneration for their ministry, because they haven't got time to hold down a job and to carry on the oversight of the ministry. Someday that's going to take place. It isn't incumbent upon you to do it now, because we are similar to the situation that Paul had in his relationship with the Corinthians. He didn't take any money from them to minister to them. Right? People couldn't live off the offerings that were given to this ministry from the local area. And I'm not belly aching. I'm simply saying it's a fact. It grows and it grows and it grows as people grow up themselves and begin to mature and to see that they have collective responsibility. You see. Paul was supported by other Christians at Corinth. He worked with his own hands. He held a job, part-time job, so that he could stay there and minister to their spiritual benefit. You see. But sooner or later, a church is going to, if it's growing, if it's going to carry its responsibility, it's going to have to take that responsibility and perform the doing of it collectively for its own needs. Now, Paul isn't dealing here. Actually, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. This is later on in the chapter that he's making that point. Here he's saying, don't just look at yourselves and your own desires. Look around you. There are other people that are in drastic needs. You know, there's something about North American Christianity that is a real blight on the name of Christ. And that is that the rich Christians are getting richer, and their poor brethren around the world are suffering terribly. If you lived in Mexico, you'd know what I'm talking about. If you lived in the Soviet Union, you know what I'm talking about. In the Philippines, in Africa, in South America, in Latin America, Christians are destitute. They're really in a bad way. And here, every time we get together, we eat so much food that we make ourselves uncomfortable. We don't need it at all. We could be saving all kinds of money, you see, and giving it to our brethren that need it. Now, that's just one single application, right? And there are whole ministries today that are run by Christians that are giving these kinds of emphasis. We have a responsibility to those around us. I'd like to just stop for a moment and take you through several scriptures in the New Testament that shows that what Paul was saying here was absolutely in line with what all the Christians back then were practicing. And it's in line with the whole philosophy of Christianity. Christianity is not a get religion, it's a give religion. It's a relationship to God that doesn't guarantee material abundance. In fact, it will lead you to the opposite if you practice your faith. Instead of it leading you to becoming a more richer and more wealthier and more powerful and more possessive person, it'll cause you to give and to give and to give. And that's just the fact of the matter. New Testament Christianity doesn't guarantee nor expect Christians just to get richer. That's a North American perversion of Christianity. Let's look at the New Testament. Hold your finger here in 1 Corinthians. Turn back with me to Acts chapter 2. The very first church was living proof of the nature of Christianity. And I'll guarantee you that if every local church around the world operated like the Jerusalem church, Christianity would be vastly different today. Vastly different. Acts chapter 2, verse 44. All that believed were together and had all things common, and sold their possessions and goods, and parted them to all men as every man had need. And they continued daily with one accord in the temple, breaking bread from house to house, did eat their food with gladness and singleness of heart, praising God and having favor with all the people. And the Lord added daily to the church such as should be saved. Over in chapter 4, verse 32, same church, same group of people, the multitude of those that believed, and there were probably about 8,000 to 10,000 Christians in Jerusalem at this period of time. It was a big assembly. All those that believed were of one heart and of one soul, and neither said any of them that any of the things which he possessed was his own, but they had all things common. And with great power gave the apostles witness of the resurrection of the Lord Jesus. And great grace was upon them all, and neither was there any among them that lacked. For as many as were possessors of lands or houses sold them, and brought the prices of the things that were sold, and laid them down at the apostles' feet, and distribution was made to every man according as he had need. And Joseph, who by the apostles were surnamed Barnabas, which is being interpreted the son of consolation, a Levite of the country of Cyprus, having land, sold it, and brought the money, and laid it at the apostles' feet. And in chapter 5, the first 11 verses is in the Bible to show us that Christian giving matters to God. If you do it as a hypocrite, God's going to damn you. He's going to judge you for it. You're going to lose all reward. And we find a couple here that paid with their lives to show the severity of it. In God's sight, Christian giving has got to be done for the right motives and for no other motives than God's motives. And yet it's got to be done. You see. And these people practiced it. In chapter 6, verses 1 to 7, we read that organization and not just funds is necessary for the meeting of local needs. In those days when the number of the disciples was multiplied, there arose a murmuring of the Grecians against the Hebrews because their widows were neglected in the daily ministration. Hold it for a minute. You know what happened to a Christian in those days when they became a Christian and were baptized, identifying themselves publicly in the local river, that they belonged to the despised Christians? They lost their job, they lost their family, they lost their possessions, they were destitute. They were kicked out of Jewish society. They were excommunicated. The same thing happened to them that happened to true Christians during the Inquisition in Spain and Italy and France and the Netherlands, that when they named the name of Christ and separated from the Roman Catholic institution, they lost everything. They lost everything, you see. And that's why Christians then had to band together like this. Now today, we don't have to live in communal lifestyle today like this. It's not unscriptural, but we don't have to because the circumstances don't warrant it. I mean, we can still hold a job in society, you see. But these people cared for one another, and they got such a large group of people that they needed reorganization. And so 7 men were chosen to help the apostles do this work, to look after the business of feeding people and providing for their needs and to sharing of funds and finances so that nobody would be left out. Now this shows us a real example. It's a precedent. The first Christian church was a sharing church amongst believers who were destitute and in need. And there weren't Christians other places in the world that they could send money to, or they would have. But we find this in Acts chapter 11. Acts chapter 11. The next biggest church that was founded in the New Testament times was at Antioch, about 100 miles, no more than that, about 200 miles north of Jerusalem in Palestine. Remember after Stephen was stoned, there was a great persecution around Jerusalem. And so Christians were forced out of the area by outright persecution, and they spread all over the Roman world making converts. In Antioch of Syria, a great number of people turned to the Lord. And we read in chapter 11, verse 26, that Paul brought Saul back from Tarsus, and when he found him, he brought him to Antioch. And it came to pass that for a whole year they assembled themselves with the church and taught many people, and the disciples were first called Christians in Antioch. And in these days came prophets from Jerusalem to Antioch, and there stood up one of them named Agabus, and signified by the Spirit that there should be great famine throughout all the world, which came to pass in the days of Claudius Caesar. Then the disciples, every man according to his ability, determined to send relief unto the brethren who dwelt in Judea, which also they did, and sent it to the elders by the hands of Barnabas and Saul. Now you bet your boots that it wasn't barter. They weren't sending chickens and pigs and bales of hay with Barnabas and Saul. They were sending money to help those people that were enduring a famine. It was just recently that we get all kinds of mail here from particularly mission boards and mission societies who are in the business of sending out missionaries to various fields in the world. We received a letter just a couple of weeks ago from GMU, which is the mission that Carol and Werner are working with. A seminary down in the States needs funds for expansion because they've got too many people and they don't have room for them. Not too long, it was last year, at the turn in December, I think, that we got a letter saying that there was a tremendous need for Christians in a place in Central Africa that their water had dried up. They were in the midst of a drought, and they needed help. They needed funds where they could drill new wells and get trucks to haul water for the Bible schools and everything that were going on down there. The Christians were suffering, you see. What about the Christians that live in Beirut? Has it ever crossed your mind? Not the Christians that are toting around the guns killing the Muslims, because those aren't Christians. Christians in name only. But I mean the genuine Bible believers, they're there. What about them? Do you know people that are destitute? What about the families of Soviet pastors and workers who have to scrape by on absolutely nothing? Because when the breadwinner is gone, the government discourages all help for those families, and their children starve to death. And we get information, we have addresses, there are people that we can help. What about, well, the needs are just limitless, but as we have opportunity, we have a responsibility to perform the doing of it. There's nothing wrong with Christians being involved in humanitarian efforts. Paul isn't dealing in 1 Corinthians chapter 16 with Christians helping the unsaved world. He's talking about Christians helping Christians. And that's our primary responsibility when it comes to physical, temporal, financial, economic matters. We have a responsibility to look out for one another. We are a community within the world. In the Bible, the very simple picture of society that is given to us is the big society, which is the cosmos world system that is satanically directed, which is anti-Christ, which is beautiful, which is totally organized, which is rich beyond measure, and corrupt. And in that cosmos, Christ is calling out a small segment, the ecclesia, the church, those that are called out from that into a new society. Now we live of necessity in the society, the world, but we are to expend our energies primarily, our physical energies, for the benefit of the local church, for the local body. Christians ought to play together, work together, fellowship together, help one another, and it's a sick church that has Christians that have no vision of their local unity. They have no desire to work and play and support one another. See, and this is what Paul is saying. Christians, you are different from your unsaved friends. Yes, as you have opportunity, Galatians 6:10, let us do good unto all men, including the unsaved world, the starving refugees, people that you meet, hitchhikers, bring them in, help them out. There's nothing wrong with that. But Paul goes on to say in that verse, as you have therefore opportunity, let us do good unto all men, but especially unto those of the household of faith. You know, there are cults that do it better than Christians today. The Mormon church is a classic example. You become a Mormon and you have guaranteed financial security. Did you know that? Now I hope you don't go join the Mormon church this week. But you become a Mormon and you have access to Mormon financial reserves if you become a good Mormon. And they're not just going to give it away to anybody. right? But they do this. There are bank accounts for Mormons and Mormons only, you see. And it's run by the whole organization. And that's an illustration of the thing that Christians ought to be doing. The only thing is, Christians are so attacked by the world, so divided amongst themselves, so nitpicky and judgmental at one another that they wouldn't do hardly peanuts for somebody who is their brother in Christ, because they have a bad attitude. There's no love. See, Paul is saying, I gave this order in Galatia, and I'm giving it to you. Now do it. Share. You have a responsibility to your fellow brothers and sisters. Now this is a blanket responsibility, and it doesn't have a bunch of loopholes that if you join the Christian church that you can be a bum and expect your brethren to feed you, because it never works that way. All you've got to do is read Titus and you'll see that. If a person doesn't work, they don't deserve to eat, and Christians ought to enforce that. Right? But anyways, Romans chapter 15 is another example. Romans chapter 15. At the conclusion of that letter, Paul wrote to them, and he said in verses 25 and following, I now am going to Jerusalem to minister to the saints, for it has pleased them. And by the way, Paul wrote Romans after he wrote Corinthians. So the Corinthians had finally done what Paul had exhorted them to do. He says, it has pleased them of Macedonia, northern Greece, and Achaia, around Corinth, to make a certain contribution for the poor saints who are at Jerusalem, and it pleased them verily, their debtors they are, for if the Gentiles had been made partakers of their spiritual things, their duty is also to minister to them in carnal things. When therefore I have performed this and have sealed to them this fruit, I will come by you into Spain. He prays in verse 31, he asked them to pray for him, that I may be delivered from them who do not believe in Judea, and that my service which I have for Jerusalem may be accepted by the saints. People have the same problem then as they do now, too proud to accept charity. Right? It's hard to receive money. In fact, it is harder to take money, would you believe, than it is to give it. It really is. It's not easy to stand there and say, and to say something to somebody that comes up to you and says, I see what you're going through, you've been out of work, here's $100, you know. Take it as unto the Lord, right? Keep it quiet about it. It's hard to take it. It really is. I've been on the receiving end lots of times, and there are some of you that know what I'm talking about. See, it's hard to take. And Paul prayed that the saints would take it. He asked them to pray for him that the saints would take it. But he says, well, we're giving money to these people. They're poor. They need it. You know, this struck me. This has struck me this year like nothing else has struck me for a long time. The Christians should have no need to go on welfare. They really shouldn't. Because the local church exists for their benefit. Right? If there is no job, Christians have a responsibility. They really do. And I can say with thankfulness in my heart that there has been a remarkable and very commendable sharing attitude in our local church here. There has been. Okay? But it's been a spontaneous thing. It has been spirit directed, I believe. But there is a much wider scope. There's a much wider scope. We don't have time to turn to 2 Corinthians chapters 8 and 9, and we'll leave that for Mike. But he is going to look at that in a few weeks. We've just given you some positive examples here. There's another example that you could read the book of Philemon. And Paul was in jail in Rome. Now get this. Paul, a revered spiritual leader, is suffering himself in a dingy Roman underground jail, probably, for his faith. And he meets a young upstart slave in jail who was caught for some reason. And he leads this young kid to the Lord, and it turns out that he knows who the guy's master was. This guy was a runaway slave, punishable by death in those days. And Paul converts Onesimus and then sends him around, gives him money when he gets out of jail, a letter to go back to his master and say, listen, If Onesimus owes you anything, put that on my account. I'll pay for this fellow. I'll pay for him. See? There's another classic example of Christian love for another brother. In Hebrews chapter 6, verse 10, the writer of Hebrews encourages them. They were suffering, and it says, God is not unrighteous to forget your labor of love and what you have done to minister to the saints, and the fact that you do continue to minister. There are negative examples too. In Titus chapter 1, Paul really comes down hard on the Cretans. There are Christians there. Paul describes them in pretty harsh terms. They're gluttons, lazy bellies, liars. They don't want to do anything. They don't want to work. They're reprobates concerning every good work. And to the Christians in that island country, Paul says now, and this is why the emphasis in Titus on good works. Maintain good works. Maintain good works. In James chapter 5, one of my favorite passages of scriptures for the day and time in which we live, James comes down very harshly on rich people who are oppressing the poor and who are totally wrapped up in their materialism and who are taking advantage of the poor. And he says, howl, ye rich men, for someday God is going to pay you back. You know, I saw a documentary on television not too long ago. And that's why Latin America is in such terrible condition. Because the United States businessmen exploited that region in Central America for the last 300 and 400 years just as bad as the Spanish and the Portuguese before them. It has been big business that has caused the political turmoil and economic turmoil in Latin America, probably as in every other place in the world. The love of money is the root of all evil. The Bible is true, you see. And rich men are really going to pay when they meet Jesus Christ. And that's why Paul exhorts rich Christians in 1 Timothy chapter 6 that they be rich in good works, you see. That they be willing to distribute and to share. These people in Jerusalem sold their houses and their properties to share it with the needs of their brethren. Okay? Now I'm not going to tell you to get rid of all your assets. But I am going to bring up a point that is very important for us as Christians to remember. Since when do we have the right not to live by faith? Every one of us. Paul says in Romans chapter 14 that whatsoever is not of faith is sin. How can you live a life of faith when you're dependent on your bank account and on your securities? Because that's the way the world operates. And Christians are to operate like the world. You read a little book called True Discipleship by William MacDonald, and here's another plug for the scripture store, Mrs. Frizzell. I wish every Christian would read that book. What it means to be a true disciple means letting go of the things of this world, possessions and things, and drawing near with a closer and harder grasp on spiritual realities, and you begin to be able to live by faith. But otherwise, your life is so wrapped up in things down here that you can't. You can't. So many Christians I have heard say, oh, I wish I could do more, but I can't. I'm too far in debt. Well, you shouldn't have got there in the first place. And it's wrong for Christians to go into debt to where they can't serve the Lord. I think Warren Wiersbe said that when your outgo exceeds your income, then your upkeep is your downfall. And I like that. Unfortunately, that's the way a lot of Christians are today, and they are unable to help their brethren when they see the needs. They're living higher than they're supposed to. I've heard the testimony of, I believe it's Dr. Ryrie. I'm not sure if it's Ryrie or someone else, one of the my dad's former teachers at Dallas Seminary. That man, very, the people that teach there get paid well at that seminary, right? And they have a big, broad base of financial support. But this man and his wife lived in a small house, very different from the rest of the staff on the seminary. Lived in a very small house that was just adequate for their needs, and they gave all their money to Central American Mission. All their money went for the work of the Lord. It didn't go into a bank account for the retirement years. You see, it went where it was supposed to work and do some good now for the Lord. Are we living a life of faith? Our money matters prove whether or not we are. Well, it boils down to that. Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 16, and we didn't even get to the other scriptures that tell us that it's more blessed to give than to receive, that tell us that when we see our brother naked and destitute, that love demands that we give. 1 John chapter 3, verses 16 to 18. Hebrews 13:16, that we're to share and to distribute with one another. This is part of our responsibility. Romans 12:13, to do good and to be hospitable to all men. Every one of us has something to give. Everyone. Nobody has something they cannot give. Even if it's a glass of water, Jesus said. You see? Now we didn't get... I'm out of time. I know I am. I don't have my watch on, but I can tell that it has to be done a certain way. The point that we have emphasized this morning is simply the first verse of 1 Corinthians chapter 16, that we have a collective responsibility as Christians to do this ministry, to give for other believers' needs and benefits. The remainder of those verses, and I'd like you to read them for next week, and I almost feel like I should pursue this 1 week further. It'll lead us into the next section anyway. That it has to be done the right way. God demands that Christian giving be done properly. And if you don't know how to give, if you've always shied away from it, if you've always gone on tradition, or just a last-minute hunch, or you felt pressured into it, then stop and reevaluate your situation. Why am I giving? Am I giving right? You read 2 Corinthians chapters 8 and 9 and get ready for Mike's series.